and welcome to another episode of Secrets of Social Impact Communicators. I'm your host, Nate Burke, and I'm really thrilled to introduce you today to Cytandra Hoover, CEO and founder of B3C Global. Cytandra is an expert in microinsurance and social impact finance. I know that's been a bit of a topic here recently and something that I'm exploring as a social impact communicator. You know, I've spent a lot of my time in climate change, racial equity, things of that nature. And so looking to better understand how other industries intersect with this really important work. In our conversation, Cytandra talks about her upbringing, traveling with her father, doing tropical botany, all the way to a career working in conflict areas that have faced severe natural disaster, and how those experiences have shaped her belief in the resilience of the human condition and how novel, innovative types of insurance and financing can help individuals address threats like climate change and be able to take care of themselves, their families. We also dive into the importance of a community focus and what we need to do in Western societies like the United States to become more community focused, to be more proactive on issues such as a changing climate, building resilience into local communities, et cetera. So whether you're a social impact leader or a communicator, or really anyone who cares about these issues facing our nation, our world, I think you have a lot to get out of this. I also learned, this is not in the interview, but Cytandra grew up on a small farm in Massachusetts. And so offline, we traded some stories and experiences about life in the country, which I love. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. Without further ado, we will go to the interview with Cytandra. Welcome back to Secrets of Social Impact Communicators. I'm Nate Burt, and I am delighted to have with me today Cytandra Hoover, who is CEO and founder of B3C Global. Cytandra, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Nate. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, Cytandra, I'd love if you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and about the origin story of your company.
Yeah, absolutely. So the story of my company is really aligned with myself and my own personal life journey and story. My father is a tropical botanist, and I grew up on a small town very much akin to a Little House on the Prairie setting out in rural Western Massachusetts, but spent my whole childhood, including through middle school and high school, traveling around the world with him on his botanical expeditions. And as a result of that, not only did I get to see the opportunities that I had from my town in Massachusetts of education and all of that, but being exposed to these wide variety of countries and communities around the world really brought home for me the differences that exist and those inequalities that come with them. And so I experienced from a very young age real abject poverty. And so from as long as I can remember, I've just had this calling to do what I can to make that nominally better, to reduce suffering, to create opportunities for others, and to hear other people's stories. And so as a result of that, I have really dedicated my life to working in this space of entrepreneurship and social impact. And that led me through a variety of careers working for the U.S. government, for the U.S. State Department and the United Nations. And then I went and pursued my MBA in entrepreneurship, and then went and spent about a decade working in formal insurance. And so the origin of my company right now, this is actually my third time launching my consulting firm, but this one really is focused with a very clear narrative around the impact and the nexus of impact, inclusion, and profit. So how to deliver social impact, social benefit by including others in the process. So that's the anthropology side. And then the profit side is the for-profit, the financial and business acumen side. And so it really brings together all of my experiences, my passions, my life story to really drive forward good in the world.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for sharing that, Cytandra. Again, just your upbringing and visiting so many diverse places around the world, I'm sure really opened your eyes and sort of led you where you are today. You know, you're at the intersection of financial services and social welfare. You talked about that earlier. Can you point to a moment in your past that you're like, that's when I knew I wanted to do what I'm doing today?
There are definitely a few. And so as I mentioned, the first decade of my career, I spent working in an industry called international development, which really is public funds, so not just from US government, but it could be from any donor agency, to really develop opportunities in developing countries, in low-income, middle-income countries. And so I was implementing multi-million dollar programs, $200, $300 million programs that were publicly funded. I loved the work. I loved being on the ground. I loved the people I was working with and all the rest. But I really came to realize, having been on the ground, and for me, really the final straw after having lived and worked in 30 some odd countries, it was country number, 40 something. And I was in Yemen. I was living and working in Yemen in the middle of Arab Spring. And we dedicated a ton of resources and time and investment in trying to foster healthcare and education in certain areas. And then Arab Spring really spurred. And after spending so much time in that arena, we shifted the funds to focus on governance. And so what my big takeaway from that experience is the sustainability and the need, and that when governments are involved, and there's definitely a role and a place for them to play, but when that is really the only angle, there's not that focus on sustainability. And so that really for me was the impetus of saying, we need to figure out other ways to build solutions for these needs that exist for human suffering, for individuals that are victims of climate disasters, of natural disasters, of wars, et cetera, from ways that really are feasible and financially sustainable in the long term. And so there are lots of stories that come from that time in Yemen, but that really for me was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back to realize that there have to be other ways of doing this work that include people in the process and focus on the long-term view.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a powerful story. And thank you for sharing that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sustainability in the context of finance, and maybe step back even further and just describe to us what microinsurance is. You mentioned this idea of building resilience, helping those affected by climate-related events and other kinds of circumstances. I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of context, because I think a lot of the people in my audience are familiar with climate change work or work in equity, especially in agriculture and natural resources, but maybe not the broader context in which you work.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a direct connection to exactly what you mentioned, including and especially in agriculture. So the premise of microinsurance, oftentimes it can also be called parametric insurance. There are different times, they each kind of have their own definitions. But basically what the idea is it's taking this concept of insurance, right, which is to define where a risk exists and then come up with a very low cost, simple way to protect that risk. So in this case, around the climate change and climate impact space, it really is about how to protect mostly vulnerable populations like agricultural workers, rural farmers, small business owners, really primarily in low-income and middle-income countries, to provide them solutions. So sometimes it's paid through subsidies, through governments, or it's through private insurance companies, but basically to provide these insurance policies to individuals to replace their income that's lost as a result of natural disasters or weather events, climatic events. And so really what the point is to create and use insurance as what I think is really what insurance is supposed to be. It's supposed to be models to protect vulnerable individuals and vulnerable communities when they don't have any other resources that are available to them. And so it brings in those spaces of social impact, because you really need to understand how the populations work and what the nuances on the ground and how you get money, monetary disbursements and what the needs and challenges and risks are. But then it's that financial side, because it is an insurance product. It's regulated. It's not a nonprofit, right? So insurance companies need and want to make money throughout the process. And so it really brings together those two sides. But at the end of the day, the goal is to protect these vulnerable populations as a result of climate change, primarily.
Thank you for that, Cytandra. That's really fascinating. If I'm in a country that maybe has limited insurance options, or like you said, I am a farmer or a farm worker, how am I learning about the option of microinsurance? Because I can imagine that there may be some logistical challenges, just given the infrastructure, the communications network that countries may or may not have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't nerd out on all the details here, I promise. But there are different types of programs. If they're provided by the government, a lot of times people don't even really know that they have it. And so people are just registered by the government. Maybe it's through an association that they're a member of, or if they have a micro loan, like through microfinance, a lot of times they might have this insurance policy as just part of what they do. So those are called involuntary policies. And then other times it actually is voluntary, where just like you and I would go and buy our auto policy or our home policy, those are the ones that are more communicated. Those are also tends to be, as you can imagine, the ones that are harder to sell, because you really have to be explaining it on an individual basis to all the individual workers or the associations that they work with, the community members. But it's a relatively nascent space, and a lot of companies are still trying to figure out what the right business model is, because a lot of times the premium, so the amount that someone pays, could be $2 or $3. And so how you figure out how to make that financially feasible and beneficial to all the parties involved is still something that's under development, but really fascinating space.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And to build on that, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the market adoption path maybe looks like, and then talk a little bit about how do you measure efficacy? Is it working?
Oh, sure. So I think what's also really interesting in this space, beyond what I just talked about, which is outside of more high income developed countries, that's where microinsurance really exists today. But I think an enormous opportunity exists in higher income countries like the US, Europe, Canada, UK, Australia, et cetera, right? Because a lot of those programs, right, you have large agricultural workers and programs that exist. And we're seeing that coming out in the news on a daily basis of if farms are impacted because of drought or because of excess rain, or because it's too hot, or because it's too cold. And we can be seeing that on nearly a daily basis. And so how you look and you measure those oftentimes are through some of the same typical claims and insurance metrics that you would use. But I do think it really depends on what type of product it is and where it is that you're working. Parametric insurance is also known as index insurance. And so that is a very relatively simple one, where basically you just put an index indicator on an event. So for example, if you have a category 1 hurricane, we're going to pay you X amount. It doesn't matter how much damage you have. It doesn't matter how many losses, right? It's just a flat amount. So that one's pretty easy. And that one really just the important part is knowing who the beneficiaries are, who those policyholders are. But I think so much opportunity really exists in the higher income countries as well as the lower income. And that's where you really can get a lot of that insurance offset by having larger portfolios.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Cytandra. So let's talk about the US for a moment, because that's where I'm based and where a lot of my listeners live and work. What are the barriers, or, is it primarily an awareness barrier that this product even exists, or are there other complexities that are going to have to be addressed either system-wide or at a local level to make this more accessible to more individuals and businesses?
Yeah, so my belief right now from conversations and research that I've done is really around the insurance business model. It really is a very different way of thinking about insurance. And just yesterday, I was reading an article in CNN about insurance companies that are pulling out of California, pulling out of Florida, because the claims are so high, the frequency is greater. And in my view, that is the old model of insurance, right? Like, oh, when claims get too high, you pull out and you move into another market. Well, unfortunately, in the world and the environment that we're in today, no market is stable, right? Every market, you're finding one, right? Like it's either housing prices, right? And issues with that, or it's auto, right? There's so many different pieces, property, casualty, etc. And so in my perspective, it really is much more about rethinking the insurance business model. And that requires different skill sets, that requires different experiences, requires different individuals and different business models themselves in terms of how the insurance companies would make money as well. But I'm convinced and I'm certain that it is financially viable. It really is just much more about having the conversation and making that work, obviously within the regulatory frameworks that are available.
Sure. Well, that's really fascinating. And yeah, your point is well taken that there's a lot in the headlines about wildfire risk, flooding, hurricanes, all those kinds of things, those things we typically associate with a changing climate. And thinking about alternatives for those who need coverage and are sorely lacking is really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Financial literacy, we've addressed a little bit. You've talked about this, just raising awareness of tools like microinsurance. How do you approach educating those who can benefit from this type of a policy, especially in areas where financial literacy may be low, whether it's a specific type of business or a community or geographic location? So talk through maybe a little bit about how do you frame and talk about this depending on the audience?
Yeah, that's a tougher question to answer. That's one I think that also very much depends on what organization that you are talking to. Everybody kind of has their own model, especially, for example, if it's with microfinance organizations that are providing insurance as a component of the work that they do versus a standalone insurance company that's providing it or some kind of an intermediary agency. In my personal perspective, just because of my own experience, having spent decades working in countries around the world, I really think it's very much of a grassroots effort. It really, and this is where I think it differs so significantly from the typical insurance model, right? The typical insurance model is very much of the large umbrella, large population base, and looking at it as a collective group and then selling an insurance product to this collective group. When you're talking about social impact and you're talking about change needed or products protection with low education and low income populations in the global south, the approach has to be very different. It is much more time consuming, and a critical component is trust. And that requires people boots on the ground, visiting communities, talking to community leaders to really engage, understand, and explain what it is. And so for these voluntary insurance products, if you really want to be able to sell them to an individual, you have to dedicate a lot of resources and time and ways to build that trust with the community. And there's some fascinating ways in which that can be done, both in which we've done in the past as well as today's through mobile phones and digital solutions. So there are lots of really interesting ways that can be done. But that is a key linchpin, is that if you really want to be able to attract a population to engage and then buy the product, you really have to spend that money, that time, the effort to build the trust with the communities.
I'm really glad you talked about trust because I think, again, certainly I can understand trust being a really essential detail for communities that might have some of the barriers that they're working to overcome, like you mentioned, whether that's economic, educational, what have you. And we see here in the United States, trust is a major issue in terms of adoption of new finance means, new technology, et cetera. I'm curious if there is a specific case study or other form of social proof that you love to point to and say, you know what, this is a great example of microinsurance working as it was intended to work?
Oh, that's a great question. The truth is, I wish I had a really good answer I could give to you. I would have to consult with the clients that I have to know whether or not I could share certain details. But I think great examples really point to large natural disasters that have occurred around the world, whether in Central America with the hurricanes that happened last year, and being able to pay out claims in short periods of time to impacted beneficiaries so that as they are still trying to rebuild their lives from the hurricane, they get an immediate deposit into their bank account. And sometimes I know, sometimes I don't know, right, depending on whether it's government or individual. But
sure,
I think those are some great examples really of where people are benefiting from it. And again, they're not large sums of money, but every little bit counts, especially when you have had your life so upended by a natural disaster.
Yeah, Cytandra, that's an excellent, very tangible example. Thank you for sharing that. That really helps me picture the way these kinds of policies can immediately make a difference in people's lives. I wonder, as you look forward, let's say the next 12 to 18 months, what trends should we be monitoring as social impact professionals in the area of things like microinsurance and social impact finance more broadly?
Yeah, I think a big area within this space is the focus on continued product development. So looking at what kinds of events are covered, how they're covered, looking at what other countries are being included in the process. Subsidies are also a big conversation point, and as governments change, that's always something that is a question mark. And subsidies, I mean, we know them here in the US, right? Our famous agricultural subsidies, but that also includes abroad as well. And so I think those are some of the key trends here to look for. What are the types of events? What are the types of trigger points that are being covered? And I personally would really like to see more of the conversation happening in the higher developed, higher income countries as well, because we're not absent from the impacts of climate change, and being able to figure out models that work in the US as well as abroad and what those models look like. And in my perspective, I think that's where a big opportunity is. And insurance is about weighing the portfolio. And so if your entire portfolio is in very small dollar amounts abroad, that's a high exposure. And so being able to balance that with different types of events where people would be paying higher premiums, that then actually allows more people to be involved in the process. And so personally, I'm looking to see where more of that work is happening in higher income countries as well. I think another component, another trend as well, is on the prevention side, which again is typically not what insurance companies look at or go after. But with the wealth of information and knowledge and data that insurance companies have, shifting focus from merely a claims response, which is the primary expense that an insurance company has, shifting it from claims, which is the payout, which is reactionary, to prevention side. So for example, in hurricane zones or where you get a lot of rain or tornado zones, right? Like, what are the solutions, tools that could be provided in advance? So is it storm windows and plywood, or do you need to make sure that people have sandbags? Do you need to make sure that people have the proper protection in their home if a hurricane comes through, so they have, ways to protect their property? So I think that's another big trend to be looking at, is how insurance companies are looking at prevention as a result of climate change and climatic events, in addition to the typical products and paying out of claims.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Cytandra. Thank you for sharing that. And it strikes me that a lot of conversations, especially in the industries that I've worked in most heavily, like food and agriculture, there's a lot of conversations about how do we incentivize good behavior? Well, we give direct cash payments, or maybe we'll provide some technical assistance. I love what you're emphasizing here, which is a need for sort of expansive thinking, greater creativity when it comes to how can we make sure that we're not just reacting, but planning, because we know these things are coming. We anticipate they're coming in the future based on what the science tells us. Anything else you'd add about that idea of creativity in the world of social impact finance?
And I think it's really interesting because the world we live in today also is moving from what used to be a very siloed view of the world, right? Companies worked in vertical silos, and now we work more in horizontal value streams. And so being able to look at a client differently, right? Not just from the development of an insurance product, from the time you pay your premium, what's your risk level, what your claim would be, but actually the end-to-end of the risk that you're trying to protect against, or the risk that you're insuring. And so thinking about it from that perspective, I also think it, for social impact professionals, for insurance professionals, is a very different way of thinking about the world. But when you think of it from that very connected perspective, that very horizontal, very linear line, you can easily be able to start to see where the needs exist. And it's always cheaper to focus on prevention than it is for reaction.
Yes, and I love that. You're so right. The prevention focus is key. Connecting the dots, thinking horizontally, all of those are extremely aligned with the things that I'm seeing in my universe. So I love hearing your perspective and just those focus areas. Cytandra, as social impact professionals and communicators, we're often moved by stories. I know I'm always on the lookout, reading and watching things and taking inspiration. And I know our audience is as well. So I'm curious if there's a story that struck you. It could be from any discipline, either in your work or in your personal life, something that stood out to you that's really inspired you or motivated you to keep going in your work in this social impact finance space.
Oh, wow. That's another hard question to answer. You're
to put you on the spot.
Today. It's hard to point to one because I've spent so much time working abroad in different countries and different environments. To me, it really is the amalgamation of those experiences that I find inspirational. And I've worked in natural disaster zones, responding to the Haiti earthquake in 2010, responding to tsunamis in Indonesia. I've worked a lot in human conflict and lived in Colombia and Yemen and Libya. But to me, really what it is the endurance of the human spirit. And to your part on stories, I think that's why I was always so driven to be an anthropologist, is that I love the human story and I love understanding people's different experiences and kind of what makes them tick and cultural differences. And to me, that's really what drives and propels me to keep going, is that there will always be a need. And so being able to know how to ask the right questions, but living with that sense of curiosity of what drives different countries and different communities to do different things, and where do the different needs exist, and what would those different solutions be. That to me is what's really fascinating and inspirational. And I've worked with former guerrilla paramilitary members in Colombia and helped integrate them back into Colombian society, and worked in Libya right after Gaddafi was killed, and was in Benghazi and working with small community associations or women-led community organizations. And so being able to understand the essence that we're all connected at a very human level and we all have the same basic needs and wants, but being able to figure out how to provide some of those solutions in different ways and being a bridge between resources and stories, to me, is what's really interesting.
Oh, that's a beautiful answer. I love that, Cytandra. And I love, again, just the perspective you've experienced firsthand. First, of course, as a young person with your father, but then also as you've continued your career in both conflict areas and areas of natural disaster. I'm curious to sort of build on what you just shared. What does it take for a person to change or to be able to withstand some of the severe upending kinds of circumstances that you've seen? What are some of the common threads about that endurant human spirit? What does it take to be able to move on and adapt and so forth?
I think a sense of community is critical. Knowing that you're not alone, that you have a community member to rely on, that there are others that are going through it. And I think of all the different conflicts and disasters and events that I worked on and responded to in my life. Most of them were outside of high-income countries. They were in the global south and developing countries. And those countries are oftentimes pounded with one conflict after another, with one disaster after another. And that leads to a sense of kind of innate resiliency, but also nerding out in anthropology a little bit. Those are countries that they're called high context countries. And those are countries that are really based around this focus where community is the center of people's lives, where your community members and how you support each other as a community, that is the focus and the epicenter of someone's life. And I think that's where it differs so much from the US or European countries, that we live very, very individualistic lives. And while we might be members of a community, right, and members of our society, it's a very different dynamic. And so I think that's part of the reason why lower income, middle income countries are able to be more resilient, and they go through conflicts, disasters, and are able to kind of pick themselves up. Not to say that they should, not to say that it's easy, not to say that there is not suffering, because there is all of that. But I think it's a big challenge here that, especially in the US, right, we don't really know how to respond when conflicts strike here, right? We saw that on 9/11. We saw that, lots of different events that have happened in the US. We really don't have those tools quite yet to know how to respond. But I think being members, knowing that there are others that are going through it with you, learning to build those communities, create those community support structures, that resiliency, those are some of the key elements that really are needed to be able to move past these conflicts or disasters that happen.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Cytandra. And I'm curious, you raised a really fascinating point, which is, I think, documented in research and popular culture, comparing the individualistic culture, Western nations like the United States, with other parts of the world. What would it take? Just thinking about, just take the issue of climate change, right? Getting more Americans on board with taking action, small, large, in between, to respond to a changing climate. What would it take in a country like the United States to move more in the direction of more of this community-focused, more resilient types? Based on your background in anthropology, I'm curious if you have a prognosis. This is not a political program at all, but I think civic engagement really is critical to addressing some of these big social impact issues that listeners of this podcast are wrestling with every day.
I think a big component of it is what you just alluded to, that this country is very polarized. And you can pick whatever your topic is, right? So just use the term social impact, and you're going to find people that are on one side or the other. Use the word climate change, and someone's going to be on one side or the other. I mean, let's not even get into political areas, right? And so I think a key element to make it sustainable, to drive forward what is needed, let's just take the US, is to put those labels aside. And to say, this is not about climate change. This isn't about social impact. This is about how, as a community, we support each other, how we build community resiliency. And if you talk about it in ways that bring more common denominators, you're able to engage a lot more people in the process. And I think that's a key component. One area, I was talking to someone the other day, that's disappeared a lot from our towns and cities in the U.S. are community centers. There used to be community centers all over the U.S. in small towns, large cities. And that helped to create community fabrics that really don't exist anymore. And so finding modern solutions that solve a similar gap, I think would really help. So whether that's, I live outside of Chicago, we get hit by tornadoes. So having, more of a community network of people who help to make sure that we have necessary alert systems in place, that we have mechanisms to check on elderly neighbors, that we have ways to make sure that people get access to food or water, or that we have shelters for people to go to. So again, taking out the politicized nature or the polarized terminology and focusing more on community engagement as a way to strengthen community fabric has ripple effects of positive externalities.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I appreciate your sharing some of those anecdotes and observations. And to give a brief aside, I'm support benevolence efforts at our church and working with trying to figure out, for example, if an individual is experiencing homelessness or food insecurity, knowing who to go to. It seems like there are some core organizations that provide pieces of those services, but trying to understand the ecosystem in your local community is so fragmented that can be very challenging. So I love this idea of sort of focusing on community versus labels and actually having some of that infrastructure in place so you know who to turn to, hopefully before a disaster strikes, to be able to really build and grow that resilience. That's really empowering, Cytandra.
It's really fascinating, and it's really interesting too, because I think anyone can do it, right? You don't have to be a large figure community mobilizer to make it happen, right? Anybody can do it. It can be as simple as identifying whether it's a church or a food shelter or whatever the different organizations, or the mayor of your town, and just finding out what exists and what needs that there are, or maybe it's a PTO through your school, right? And so just working with the organizations that already exist. It's not an operations person, and it despise duplication of effort. And so I really think about finding what already exists and figuring out ways to add value, right? Not necessarily doing something new or doing something different, but really just strengthening the fabric that and institutions that already exist is a great way to get started.
That's a great illustration of adding value, not duplicating, but really just considering what everyone's strengths they bring to the table, and then knowing those exist and then leveraging them to help as many people as possible. I love that vision. When people look back on the life and career of Cytandra Hoover, what do you want people to say about you? Deep question, I know.
Probably that I did what I could to reduce suffering, to listen to people, to hear stories, to make a difference and to bring people together, to help build some of that resiliency and bridge the divides that exist in the world today. I'm not aspiring to be some Mahatma Gandhi, but definitely just do my part, right? Which is what I think any human can do, just through my daily actions. And I think the other one, I'm the single mother of a 9-year-old boy. And to me, the other one is leaving my son to be the best human that he can be. That to me is another key factor.
I love that, Cytandra, and very empathetic as a father of 4, including 3 sons. That is a full-time job, and there's a combination of diligence and pouring into someone and faith that it's all going to work out in the home. So I love that vision.
I'll take it from you.
The last question I have for you, Cytandra, and then I'll open it up for anything else you might want to add. Where can people go to learn more about you and your company?
Yeah, the best way is LinkedIn, because I have a name that's oftentimes hard to spell and hard to pronounce. LinkedIn is the best place to find me. All my links are on there. But as B3C it stands for Be the Change. And so the focus really is on working with organizations to help to drive forward their social impact initiatives, really through that for-profit focus. So lots of services that I provide as a result of that, but it really is working at that nexus of impact, inclusion, and profit.
That's awesome, Cytandra. We'll be sure to include links in the show notes so folks can go and check out all of the great work you're doing. What else would you like to add as we're wrapping up today? It's been a real treat. And any last thought you'd like to leave with the audience?
Everybody do your part. Whatever it is, just small incremental amounts all add up. So don't be discouraged, which is very easy nowadays, no matter where you stand, but just have faith and do your part to make a difference.
Awesome. I will not add to that. That's beautiful. Cytandra Hoover is CEO and founder of B3C Global. Cytandra, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned so much, and I know my audience will too.
Thanks, Nate. And thanks all of you.
Well, that does it for another episode of Secrets of Social Impact Communicators. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Cytandra as much as I did. I want to remind you that my new book, 7 Secrets of Highly Effective Social Impact Communicators, is now available wherever books are sold, and encourage you to check that out. That's my framework for really taking these big issues and making them manageable, especially for those who have a communications function, whether you're a CEO, an executive director, vice president of marketing and communications within your organization. These are really insights that I've gleaned working with my clients, listening to other experts for managing complex projects, making yourself whole, and really leaning into your values and those of your organization to make positive change in any kind of social impact work. As always, I want to thank Lee Williams, our fantastic editor of this podcast. And until next time, remember, social impact work is soul work. Lead like you live.